Isn't this the GSXR 750 we did the fairing on a year ago?
Sure is. It's in today to get the front fork seals replaced. Hello, my name's Bob.
I'm Andrew.
And we'd like to welcome you to yet another episode on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. Today's episode is going to be about replacing the fork seals on a Suzuki GSXR 750. And I hope you follow along.
To remove the forks, you first have to remove the front mudguard or fender, the front brakes, and then the front wheel. After removing the screws and the brake line clips from the front mudguard, the sides of the guard were compressed in, the unit was lifted up and pulled forward to get it out. Then it was on to removing the bolts that hold the brake calipers on. Don't let the calipers hang by their brake lines. Either rest them on a platform, as is shown here.
Yeah. And she was asking me.
Or hook them up to somewhere on the bodywork, as we've shown here. Then it was on to removing the front wheel. First, the right hand side clamp bolts were undone to allow the axle nut to be removed, which was then done, followed by the axle and then the wheel itself. Lastly, the top sections of the air dam or chute that directs the airflow to the radiator needs to be removed. The front section was held in place by a series of panel clips which needed to be released before the panel could be slid back, down and out. The rear section is attached to the bottom of the steering head by two 6mm diameter bolts, which need a 10mm socket to undo. These were undone and the panel removed. There is a steering damper there, but it's not necessary to remove that. The replacement of the fork seals is the same for both forks, so only the one side will be shown in this video. Start by undoing the two clamp bolts that secure the top of the fork. With the fork still held by the bottom clamp bolts, the fork cap is backed off. You can leave the fork cap until later, but they can be quite tight, and undoing the cap with the leg clamped in the vise risks marking or denting the fork surface, which is why it was done here. With the fork cap loosened, the bottom clamp bolts were undone. The fork leg was then pulled down and out, and it was off to the bench. Over at the bench, the fork leg was put in the vise and the cap undone all the way. The fork cap then needs to be unscrewed from the attached adjuster rod. Below the cap is a spacer unit and then the fork spring. This spacer unit needs to be pulled down against the fork spring before the lock nut below the cap can be undone, after which the cap can then be unscrewed from the rod and removed. There are a series of Suzuki special tools that can be used to do this, but we don't have them. However, where there is a will, there is a way, and this video will show you how to do it without those special tools. The spacer is made of steel and has two holes on opposite sides, top and bottom. We inserted 10mm diameter bolts into the top two holes, and with the jaws of an adjustable spanner over them, forced the spacer down, which allowed the lock nut to be loosened and the fork cap unscrewed. Once this was done, the spacer unit and the spring retainer were removed.
There you go. Where'd it go? Where'd it go?
The fork was then inverted, the spring removed, and the old fork oil drained into a pan. The dust seal was then slid up the inner tube. The spring clip that holds the fork seal in place was prized away from its recess and removed. Then, with a few pumps of the inner tube, it was slid out of the outer tube.
Voila.
A screwdriver was then used to pry away the bearing bush from its recess on the inner tube. It is a split ring, and expanding the slit width a small amount allows it to be removed from the tube. Then the seal retaining washer, fork seal and dust seal were all slid off the fork tube.
See? That's where it's pudded. And then the dust seal.
New dust seals and fork seals were obtained for this repair. They were an aftermarket set. The brand is All Balls Racing.
Can I show something?
The inside of the dust wipers and the fork seals need to be lubricated. You can do this either with clean fork oil or a rubber grease, and the latter was used here. Just a light coating is all that was needed. It's just to get the component ready for action and to ease it onto the fork tube and over the bushing recess without damaging the inside surface. The dust cover goes on first. Followed by the fork seal. Then the retaining washer.
Hold that down.
And finally the fork bushing is refitted. The inner tube was then reinstated into the outer tube, and the seal retaining washer and the fork seal slid down into the outer tube. The fork seal needs to be seated in its recess in the outer tube, and a fork seal driver was used to do this. The driver comprises 3 curved legs on an adjustable band. The legs are moved so as to be spaced evenly around the fork tube, and the band bent so that they are firm up against the outer wall of the inner fork tube. Two half cylinders are positioned around the fork tube and are used as a slide hammer to drive the fork seal into position on the outer tube. With the seal in position, the spring clip was then refitted. Finally, the dust cover was slid down onto the top of the outer tube. After that, the fork was inverted and placed upright in the vise, and about 450 millilitres of Penrite 10W fork oil was added to the fork. Not shown here, but after the oil was added, the inner rod was pumped up and down several times to bleed air out of the system, after which the fork leg was left in the contracted position for about 10 to 20 minutes to allow for any bubbles to escape. It's a good time for a cuppa. For a given amount of oil in the fork tube, the level will vary slightly from leg to leg due to internal volume differences. To overcome this, the amount of fork oil is specified as the distance of the oil level below the top of the compressed fork leg with the spring removed. For this model of GSXR, that distance is 115 millimeters or 4.5 inches. To achieve this level, the fork leg is overfilled and the excess oil withdrawn until the distance is correct. A special tool called a fork oil level gauge is used to do this. The one used in this video was made here in the workshop. It consists of 2 plates which clamp around a thin metal tube. The plate position on the tube is adjusted so that the distance from the bottom of the plate to the end of the tube is the specified fork oil level. If you don't have the special tool, you could equally use a plastic tube taped to a thin ruler with the end at 115mm or 4.5 inch mark, and just align the ruler 0 to the top of the tube and then draw off the excess oil with a syringe. Having adjusted the oil level, the spring was reinserted and we set about refitting the fork cap. A wire was wrapped around the bottom of the lock nut on the adjuster rod to hold it up, and the spacer assembly was fed over the wire and down to the top of the spring. The 2 10mm diameter bolts were inserted in the top 2 holes of the spacer. and the spacer pulled down below the level of the lock nut, after which the wire was removed and the fork cap fitted. The fork cap and lock nut were then tightened together. And with that all done, the fork cap was then screwed down into the fork tube and the unit was ready to be refitted to the bike. Refitting the fork leg is essentially the reverse of removing it, and we won't go into any detail with that. However, an important point to note is the tops of the fork legs need to both sit at the same distance above the top clamp. Here, a ruler was used to measure that distance using a corresponding set point on both sides. The outer fork leg is beveled at the top, and the distance used was essentially to the bottom of this level. The lower clamp bolts were then tightened up. Followed by the fork cap.
Plus the mirror gives us a great view.
And finally the top clamp bolts. After the second fork leg was done, the radiator ducting, front wheel, mudguard, brakes were all then reinstalled and the job was finished.
Looks like we're done.
Yep.
Well, thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, we'd welcome a thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed, well, think about subscribing. It's easy. Just hit the subscribe bar down below. While you're there, ding the bell so that you get a notification from YouTube the next time a video comes out on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. Thank you again.
Bye.